His breath fogged the space between them, a small human heat that felt like a promise and a question, and the name at the door still hung in the wood, like a coin pressed into bark. The word had landed and not left. It had weight. It made the cabin feel smaller, as if the walls had leaned in to listen. He could feel the press of the riders beyond the timber, boots, leather, the slow, patient rhythm of men who read the land for secrets. And the air in the room tightened around that sound. She lay with her head turned toward him, lashes trembling, the rune at her throat a faint blue coin beneath linen. Fear had hollowed her cheeks. The bruise at her temple was a dark bloom. Her fingers curled and uncurled against the furs, like someone testing whether a knot would hold. When she looked at him, the eyes that met his were raw, with a question she could not yet name. The soldier in him catalogued the facts: wounds, pulse, the way the mark pulsed in time with the hearth. But another part of him, a part that had learned to keep small mercies, answered with a steadiness that surprised him. He had not meant to be a guardian. He had meant only to pass the ridge, check snares, keep the ledger of his life tidy. Yet here he was, shoulder pressed to the door, the wood a thin thing between a woman with a river's mark and men who would read that mark like a debt. He did not know her name beyond the syllable the leader had spoken, but names are not always necessary when the body speaks. His hand found hers on the pallet, fingers closing around damp skin. The contact was a small, fierce thing, an anchor. She flinched at the sound of a boot on the porch, a soft, testing step that made the latch rattle. The rune under her linen brightened, a thread of light that ran like a vein. The glow was not loud, but it was intimate. It made the shadows in the room lean away. She swallowed, and the motion made the bruise at her throat move like a dark tide. For a breath, she looked like someone who had been pulled from a deep river and was still learning how to breathe air. He warmed broth between his palms and held it to her lips. The steam fogged the space between them. The scent of meat and peat was a small, human thing that cut the cold. She drank with a hunger that was more than hunger, an animal need for warmth, for something to steady the world. When she set the bowl down, her fingers brushed his, and the touch lingered. A spark that was not quite a confession, but not nothing either. The room felt too full of small mercies. The way he smoothed the furs over her shoulders, the way his thumb wiped a smear of peat from her cheek, the way his breath matched hers until their chests rose and fell in the same slow rhythm. There was a softness to him now that had not been there on the ridge. War had taught him to be a wall. This was different. This was the careful, patient work of keeping a life from unraveling. He found himself speaking in low, practical sentences, where he had hidden extra blankets, how long the hearth would hold, what to do if the door gave. The words were small and useful, and they steadied both of them. She listened as if each sentence were a rope thrown across a dark river. Her voice came then, thin as a thread. "They will not understand," she said, and the words were not a plea so much as a fact. The rune pulsed in answer, a faint bell under the skin. He did not ask what she meant. The ledger of the land had taught him that some things are not for questions. Instead, he tightened his grip on her hand and let the silence be a vow. "I will not let them take you." The closeness between them felt impossible and inevitable at once. It was not the sudden blaze of love, but the slow, dangerous knitting of two people who had been taught to keep their wants small. He thought of the market woman he had watched from a distance years ago, of the way a hand can be both a tool and a benediction. He thought of the child's laugh he had glimpsed in the river's film, the small life that had been saved by a name taken. The thought made his chest ache with a tenderness he had not expected to feel. Outside, the riders moved like a tide. Torches bobbed along the ridge, orange against the aurora's green seam. The leader's voice carried again, low and precise, a sound that read like a ledger. He could hear men calling names, the soft, methodical search of those who know how to find what is hidden. The porch creaked under a weight. The latch was tested with a hand that did not yet force it. The sound made the cabin feel like a throat about to be opened. She turned her head and looked at him with a steadiness that steadied him in return. "If they take the mark," she whispered, "they take what I bargained with." The words were a confession and a warning braided together. The rune at her throat flared brighter, as if the mark itself had heard and answered. The light under the linen painted his fingers blue, where they held hers. He wanted to promise her safety with a soldier's certainty. He wanted to stand at the door and meet the world with spear and oath. Instead, he pressed his forehead to hers for a breath, a small benediction that felt like a vow. The contact was a private thing, too intimate for the ledger outside, too human for the cold arithmetic of the riders. It said, "I will not let you go." A shadow moved across the window, and the torchlight flared like a wound. The sound of a horse shifting, a soft snort, reached the cabin as if the animal itself were listening. The leader's voice, closer now, called out a name that was not hers, but that had been used to find her. A knock then, soft, deliberate, at the door. Bootsteps struck the porch like a verdict, hard and deliberate, and the torchlight flared against the window in a wash of orange that made the cabin look like a thing under interrogation. Voices moved outside, low, methodical, the kind that read the land for secrets. The leader's tone threaded through them, precise, patient, the voice of men who had learned to find what others thought hidden. The latch rattled again, a soft, testing sound that made the wood tremble under his shoulder. He moved without sound. The soldier in him folded into the room like a shadow. He eased from the pallet, every motion measured, and wrapped her in furs as if the cloth could be a second skin. Her breath hitched when he shifted her. The bruise at her temple darkened with emotion. She did not speak. Her eyes were wide and raw, and shame sat in them like a stone, an old, private thing that made her look smaller than she was. He had choices that were all dangerous. Hide her in the loft beneath the eaves, and hope the rider's eyes skimmed past. Carry her into the trees and trust the pines to swallow two shadows. Stand at the door and meet them with spear and oath. Each option had a cost. Each choice was a line drawn in snow. He chose movement, not bravado, not a plan, a necessity. He lifted her with the careful strength of a man who has carried the wounded and the dead, and learned the difference by touch. Her weight was a small, living thing against his chest. The damp of her hair left a river scent on his cloak. He moved toward the ladder to the loft, every step a prayer against the creak of old wood. She whispered then, a sound like a thread pulled tight. "They will not stop," she said, and the words were not a plea, but a fact. Shame braided with fear in her voice. They will take what the river gave. The rune at her throat pulsed faintly beneath the linen, a blue coin that made the air taste of iron. the light under the skin seemed to answer her words with a small, cold flare. He climbed the ladder with her in his arms, the loft a dark pocket above the hearth. He tucked her among sacks and furs, covering her face with a spare cloak, so only the faintest line of hair showed. The loft smelled of grain and old wool. It was a small, private place that might pass for storage to a hurried eye. He smoothed the cloak over her shoulders and let his hand rest on the edge of the pallet, feeling the pulse at her wrist through the fabric. The contact steadied him. Below, the riders moved like a tide. Torches bobbed along the ridge, orange against the aurora's indifferent green. The leader's men tested the porch, their boots a slow, patient drum. A torchlight swept the cabin's window and paused, as if the light itself were listening. He could hear the men's voices, names called, questions asked, the soft, methodical search of those who know how to find what is hidden. He crouched at the loft's edge and listened. The soldier in him catalogued the sounds, the scrape of leather, the clink of harness, the low murmur of men comparing marks. The man who had buried friends and enemies both felt the old, familiar ache of helplessness when faced with a ledger that could not be read with spear or oath. He wanted to stand at the door and meet them with steel. He wanted to carry her into the trees and vanish. He wanted to do both and knew he could not. A shadow passed the window, and the torchlight painted the room in quick, dangerous strokes. He could see the leader's silhouette framed by the doorway, the furred cloak catching the fire in a hard gleam. The men moved with purpose, their search methodical. They checked the hearth, the pantry, the loft's ladder. A boot thudded on the porch. The latch was tested again, this time with a hand that did not hesitate. From below, a voice called out, low and precise. "Search the loft," it said, and the order was obeyed. The men moved like a tide, boots on the ladder, torches held high. The sound made the cabin feel like a throat about to be opened. She made a small sound then, a breath that was half fear and half shame. "I bargained," she whispered, and the confession was a thing that made him want to strike the world. "I gave a name to save a life. I thought—" Her voice broke. The shame in her was not for the bargain itself, but for the way the world would read it, as theft, as witchcraft, as a debt to be collected with hands that do not ask whether the price was love. He felt the old, stubborn resolve rise in him like a tide. War had taught him how to hold a line. This was different. This was the careful, patient work of keeping a life from being read as a ledger entry. He pressed his palm flat against the loft's boards and let the wood be the hinge of his intent. He would be the wall. He would be the shadow that swallowed the light. A torchlight swept the loft's opening. A boot creaked on the ladder. The man below muttered something that made his blood run cold, words that were not merely searching but certain. "The mark of hell," the rider said, and the syllables were a verdict. "Bring her down, Nerith will answer for what she took." The name landed in the loft like a stone. She spoke a name she did not remember learning, and the loft folded inward as if the roof itself had leaned to listen. The syllable came out of her like a breath that had been held too long, thin, precise, older than the market's gossip. It hung in the rafters, and the sacks of grain seemed to hush. The rune at her throat answered with a thread of light that ran beneath the linen like a vein, and the light made the shadows in the loft move as if they had their own breath. A memory unspooled across her face, quick, bright, and wrong for the room. Stone halls, not the cabin's low beams, candles guttering in a wind that smelled of peat and iron. A long table where hands passed tokens and names like coins. She mouthed shapes that were not words but images. A river that counted, a ledger of bones, a woman cupping a fevered child and offering a name into the dark. The fragments did not fit together in a tidy line. They were shards that made the present sharper by contrast. The rune pulsed in time with the images, a small, patient drum under skin. He watched her with a kind of attention that had nothing to do with orders. The soldier in him catalogued the facts. The bruise at her temple, the way her fingers curled as if still holding something invisible. But another part of him, a part that had been softened by the small mercies of the cabin, leaned in. The sight of her memory, of a bargain struck in a fevered night, made his chest ache with a tenderness he had not expected. He had been a man who kept his wants small. Now he felt the dangerous pull of wanting to keep her whole. The rune's light deepened, a blue that was not quite fire and not quite water. It threaded along the hollow of her throat and then, impossibly, seemed to reach outward as if the mark itself were listening for an answer. The loft's air cooled. His breath fogged and hung between them like a small, fragile thing. He moved closer, not to pry, but to be a presence, a human warmth against whatever ledger the world kept. His hand hovered over the furs, then settled on her wrist, feeling the stubborn pulse beneath the skin. The contact steadied him and, he hoped, steadied her. She blinked, and the memory sharpened into a single image. A hall of the dead, where a woman in reed crowns read names from a slate of bone. The dead king sat at the far end, a shadow with a ledger, and the river ran through the hall like a black seam. The woman, her hands were small in the memory, offered a name, and the river took a seam in return. The bargain was precise and terrible. A life returned, a name taken, a mark sewn into flesh. The image was not accusation, it was accounting. The rune under her skin pulsed, as if the memory had been a coin placed on a table. He had heard whispers in the market, old wives' tales about the river that keeps accounts, about priestesses who barter with names. But the sight of the memory made the myth feel like a thing with teeth. The world outside the loft seemed to rearrange itself around that knowledge. The aurora above the ridge braided tighter, a green seam that looked like a promise or a warning. The riders below moved with the methodical patience of men who read ledgers for profit. Their torches bobbed like angry stars. Myth was no longer a story told by the hearth. It was a ledger with margins that could be read by those who knew how. She tried to speak the name again, and the sound that came was a whisper of water over stone. Hell, she breathed, and the syllable was a small, terrible bell. The rune flared in answer, brighter now, and the loft's shadows seemed to lean away, as if something outside had heard and answered. The light under her skin ran like a river, and for a moment the world felt like a page being turned. He wanted to ask what she had given, what life had been bought with that name. He wanted to know whether the child in the memory had lived, whether the bargain had been mercy or theft. The questions crowded him like winter wind. Instead, he pressed his forehead to hers, a small benediction that felt like a vow. The contact was a private thing, too intimate for the ledger outside, too human for the cold arithmetic of the riders. It said, "I will not let them take you." Her fingers tightened around his hand, as if to anchor herself to the present. The rune pulsed again, and this time the reaction was not only light, but a ripple that ran through her body. Her breath hitched, her face contorted, as if a cold hand had closed around her sternum. The motion was sudden and violent, a thing that made the sacks rustle and the loft's ladder creak. He braced, instinct sharpening into action, but the look she gave him was not of accusation. It was of someone who had been given a ledger and did not know how to pay it. A sound rose from her throat, not a word, but a small, animal noise of pain. The rune's light flared white-hot beneath the linen, and the loft filled with a smell like iron and riverstone. He felt the heat of it through the furs, a burning that was not fire, but something older. Her body convulsed once, twice, and the motion sent a thin spray of sweat across his palm. The pulse at her wrist raced, then stuttered. She gasped, a sound that cut the hush like a blade. The curse, if it could be called that, was not sleeping. It was waking. He almost said the name of the boy he could not save, and the confession hung between them like a thin, dangerous thread. The words died in his throat. The loft's dark swallowed them. He pressed his forehead to the palette's edge and let the silence be the thing that spoke instead. The loft smelled of grain and old wool, and the faint river scent that clung to her hair. Outside, the world was a ledger of boots and torches. Inside, the room narrowed to breath, and the small, stubborn warmth of two bodies. He moved with the careful patience of a man who has learned how to keep a life from unraveling. The ladder creaked under his weight, and the loft's hatch closed like a lid. He wrapped her in furs and carried her through the night. The snow a soft, indifferent carpet that swallowed their tracks. The aurora braided the sky above them, green seams that made the world look like a thing, stitched together and waiting to be opened. He did not speak of the riders. There was no need. The rhythm of their pursuit was a drumbeat in his bones. The sanctuary of fire was a place the old men in the market spoke of in half voices. An ember-hidden refuge in the mountain where the hearth never quite died, and the runes on the stone remembered names. He had found it once in a winter when the world had been less kind, and the memory of that discovery had become a map he kept folded in his chest. The path to it was a secret carved by foot and memory, a narrow cleft in basalt, a stair that smelled of resin and old smoke, a door that opened into a hollow, warmed by a hearth that had been tended for generations. They entered like trespassers into a holy place. The air inside was thick with resin and the slow, sweet smoke of pine. The hearth was a low sun, a ring of iron that held a fire that did not roar but hummed, as if it were a thing that had learned to be patient. Runes were carved into the stone around the hearth, simple old marks that caught the firelight and threw it back in small, blue tongues. The room was small and round, a womb of stone that smelled of ash and salt, and the faint, impossible scent of riverstone warmed by sun. He laid her on a pallet of furs and sat opposite, the fire between them a small, honest light. For a moment, they simply breathed. The rune at her throat pulsed faintly beneath the linen, a blue coin that made the air taste of iron. The sanctuary seemed to listen. The carved marks on the wall threw shadows that moved like slow hands. Here, in the hollow of the mountain, the world felt less like a ledger and more like a thing that could be bargained with. He touched the scar along his forearm without thinking, the motion a confession in itself. The skin there was pale and puckered, a white seam that ran from wrist to elbow. He had kept it hidden for years, a private geography of a night he did not speak of. Now, with the fire between them and the riders, a distant drum, he rolled the sleeve back and let the light show the wound. She watched him with a tenderness that made his chest ache. Her fingers, still damp from the river, hovered over the scar, as if afraid to close the distance. "You carry it like a story," she said, voice small, as if the words might wake something in the stone. The rune at her throat pulsed in answer, a faint bell under the skin. He told her the story into fragments, the way the spear had come, the way the line had broken, the name of a man he had not been able to save. He did not speak the name aloud. Some things are kept like tinder, useful and dangerous. The confession was not a plea for absolution. It was a ledger entry offered without flourish. I failed. The scar was the proof. She reached out then, and the motion was both fear and tenderness. Her fingers brushed the pale seam, tracing it as if reading a map. The touch was light, reverent. "You kept something," she whispered, and the words were a benediction. "You did not let it go." Her thumb lingered where the skin had been torn and healed, and the warmth of her hand made the old ache in him ease like a tide. He had not expected such softness. War had taught him to be a wall. This was different. This was the careful, patient work of two people, learning how to hold one another without breaking. The sanctuary's fire hummed, and the carved runes threw blue light across their faces. For a moment, the world narrowed to the press of palms and the small, human heat between them. She flinched then, a small, involuntary motion that made his hand clamp around hers. The rune at her throat pulsed brighter, a thread of light that ran like a vein beneath the linen. The glow was not loud, but it was intimate. It made the shadows in the room lean away. Her breath hitched, the bruise at her temple darkened, as if the memory of the river had folded back on itself. "What is it?" he asked, voice low, the soldier's steadiness returning like a shield. She did not answer with words. Instead, a memory flashed across her face. Stone halls, candles guttering, hands passing tokens and names like coins. The rune's light deepened, and the carved marks on the sanctuary's wall seemed to stir as if in recognition. The fire smoke curled upward, and the room's single window, a slit in the basalt, framed the aurora like a seam. The rune flared then, sudden and bright, as if struck by a bell. The light under her skin ran like a river, and the hearth's embers flared in sympathy. The sanctuary's carved runes threw long, blue shadows that reached towards the doorway as if to warn. Something unseen approached, no hoofbeat yet, no shout. But the mountain felt the motion like a living thing. He tightened his grip on her hand. The fire hummed. The rune pulsed again, answering a presence the ear could not yet name. His thumb found the pale seam at her wrist, and the room shrank to that single, impossible warmth. The touch was a confession before either of them had words for it. The fire hummed low between them, a patient sun that threw their faces into soft relief. The carved runes on the stone caught the light and threw it back in thin, blue tongues. For a moment, the mountain held its breath with them, and the only sound was the small, human rhythm of two chests learning to match. She watched his hand as if it were a thing both dangerous and holy. Her fingers twitched beneath the furs, the motion small and raw. Shame and fear braided in the hollows of her cheeks. The bruise at her temple was a dark bloom, that made her look younger than she was. "I did what I had to," she said, voice athread. The words were not a plea. They were a ledger entry offered without flourish. "I gave a name to save a life." He did not answer with a sermon or a plan. He answered with a steadiness that had been honed in trenches and on frozen ridges. "Then I will keep it," he said, and the sentence landed like a stone thrown into still water. It was not a promise made lightly. It was a vow that rearranged the room. The fire flared as if in recognition. The carved runes threw longer shadows that reached toward them like slow hands. She blinked, and something like relief and terror crossed her face. "You cannot know what that means," she whispered. The rune at her throat pulsed in sympathy. A thin blue coin beneath linen. The light under her skin brightened, answering his words with a bell struck underwater. The mountain seemed to lean in. The slit of a window framed the aurora like a seam, and the green light braided the hearth's orange into a strange, other color. He rolled his sleeve back and showed her the pale scar along his forearm, the white seam that had been a map of a night he did not speak of. "I have carried things," he said, voice low. "Names, promises, men I could not save." The confession was a small thing, but it made the air between them change. She reached out, fingers trembling, and traced the scar as if reading a map. Her touch was reverent and fierce. "You carry them like a burden," she said, and the words were both observation and benediction. "You do not let them rot in the cold." Her thumb lingered where the skin had been torn and healed, and the warmth of her hand made the old ache in him ease like a tide. The closeness between them felt forbidden and inevitable. Two people who had learned to keep once small finding in the hush that they wanted the same thing. He wanted to say more. He wanted to tell her that the ledger he kept had a margin now, that her name had been written there in a hand that did not always keep its promises. He wanted to tell her that the market woman he had watched years ago had been a ghost that taught him how to look without touching, and that she, this woman with river-scented hair and a rune under her skin, had made him want to break that rule. The words hovered and did not fall. Instead, he let his hand close around hers and held it like an oath. "Then I will keep it," he repeated, and this time the vow was a thing that felt dangerous and binding. "I will keep your name in my mouth and in my blood. I will not let them read it from your skin." The fire answered with a low, approving crackle. The carved runes on the stone seemed to glow a fraction brighter, as if the mountain itself had heard and accepted the bargain. Outside, the wind shifted, and the aurora braided tighter, a green seam that looked like a promise or a warning. She swallowed, and the motion made the bruise at her throat move like a dark tide. "If they take the mark," she said, voice small, "they take what I bargained with. They will not stop at me." The rune pulsed under the linen, a bright, cold bell. The light ran like a river beneath her skin, and the sanctuary's carved marks threw long, blue shadows that reached toward the doorway as if to warn. He pressed his forehead to hers then, a small benediction that felt like a vow. The contact was intimate and dangerous. It said what words could not yet hold. "Then I will stand between them and you," he whispered. "I will be the ledger they cannot read." The promise tasted of iron and peat and something softer. Hope, perhaps, or the stubborn belief that two people could make a margin where the world kept accounts. She closed her eyes, and for a breath, the mountain hummed with them. The rune's glow steadied, as if the mark itself had been soothed by the vow. The fire's light warmed their faces, and the carved runes threw blue tongues that licked at the edges of the palette. For a moment, the world outside the stone felt distant, like a story told in another room. Then the night answered, with a sound that made the sanctuary's small peace shudder. A horn, low and precise, rolled across the ridge and into the valley. It was not the casual call of hunters. It was a summons, a note that carried the weight of men who had read ledgers and found a debt. The sound made the pines whisper and the aurora shiver. She opened her eyes and the fear returned, sharper now. The rune at her throat flared, bright and insistent. The mountains carved marks through longer shadows that pointed toward the door. The vow between them felt heavier, as if the world had heard and set its own counterweight. A howl answered the horn from somewhere beyond the ridge, wild, close, and full of hunger. The sound braided with the horn and the wind and made the sanctuary's single window frame, the aurora, like a seam of green fire. He tightened his grip on her hand. The promise had been made. The ledger had been marked. They moved like thieves of the dark, quick, low, and with the kind of silence that comes from knowing every creak of a place by heart. The sanctuary's hatch closed behind them with a soft, final sound, and the mountain swallowed the echo as if it had never been. Snow hit their boots in a cold, wet slap. The aurora braided the sky above in slow, green seams that made the world look stitched together and fragile. There was no time for tenderness that could be named. There was only the urgent geometry of two bodies moving as one. He carried what he could, a small pack of dried meat, a wrapped loaf, a length of rope, the spare cloak that smelled of resin. She walked beside him when she could, leaning on him in the places where the river's memory still made her knees tremble. The rune at her throat pulsed faintly beneath the linen, a blue coin that caught the aurora and gave it back in a thin, cold light. Each pulse was a metronome for their flight. They left the sanctuary like people leaving a church after a storm, hushed, reverent, and with the sense that something holy had been disturbed. The carved runes around the hearth threw long blue shadows that reached towards the cleft in the basalt as if to warn them. He glanced back once, and the slit of the sanctuary's window framed the hearth's dying glow like an eye. The mountain closed its mouth behind them, and the world narrowed to the path he knew by memory, a stair of basalt, a narrow ledge, a slope that fell away into white. They moved fast where the path allowed, slow where the cliff demanded patience. The wind cut at their faces with a blade of cold. Snow hissed in the air, and the pines leaned away, as if listening. He kept his hand on the small of her back, a steadying pressure that said more than words could. She leaned into that pressure as if it were a rope thrown across a river. The closeness between them had changed. It was no longer only shelter. It had become a thing that carried meaning, dangerous, binding, and utterly human. At a narrow bend, he stopped them and drew a breath that fogged in the air. The ridge below opened into a valley that the aurora painted in ghostly light. Torches bobbed there like angry stars. The riders had not been fooled by the sanctuary's silence. They had read the ledger of tracks and margins and followed the line. He could see the dark shapes of men and horses moving along the lower path, the torches making the snow look like a wound. She pressed her forehead to his shoulder and the rune at her throat flared in sympathy, a bright, cold bell. "They will take the mark," she whispered, voice thin as a thread. Shame and fear braided in the syllables. "They will read it, and they will not understand why I did it." The confession was a small, terrible thing. The wind took it and scattered it like ash. He wanted to answer with a soldier's certainty. He wanted to say he would stand and fight, that he would meet them with spear and oath and not let the ledger be read. Instead, he tightened his grip and let the promise be in the pressure of his hand. "Then we will not let them read it," he said, and the vow was a thing that rearranged the night. "We will move until the ledger forgets the margin." They picked their way down the far side of the ridge, where the pines grew thick and the snow held shadows like secrets. The path narrowed to a deer run, then to nothing but the soft, yielding slope of old avalanches. He led them through a stand of birch, whose trunks were pale as bone. The tree's branches braided overhead and made a tunnel of green and white. The world felt like a throat closing and opening, and every step was a small prayer. She spoke then, a sound that was almost a laugh and almost a sob. "You keep making promises," she said, and the words were a thing both tender and dangerous. "You do not know me." The rune pulsed beneath the linen, a thin blue coin that made the air taste of iron. He answered with a small, private truth. "I know enough," he said, "enough to stand." The sentence was not a boast. It was a ledger entry offered without flourish. The closeness between them deepened in the hush, fingers brushing, a shoulder pressed. The way their breaths began to match, like two oars finding rhythm in the same current. The danger made the small mercies sharper. They moved through the night like two shadows stitched together. The aurora braided the sky above them, and the world felt mythic and terrible. He thought of the child's laugh he had glimpsed in the river's film, of the bargain struck in a fevered room, of the ledger that kept accounts in names and seams. He thought of the scar along his forearm and the way her fingers had traced it in the sanctuary, and the memory of that touch warmed him like a small, stubborn ember. A sound rose behind them then, low and patient at first, and the air changed as if the world had been given a new instruction. Hooves struck the packed snow in a rhythm that was not random. The riders were moving faster. Torches bobbed like angry stars along the ridge. Voices carried on the wind, low, precise, the kind that read the land for secrets. The leader's horn answered from below, a single, rolling note that made the pines whisper. He did not look back. He could feel them, like a pressure in the air, like the way a tide announces itself before it breaks. The sound grew, the clink of harness, the snort of horses, the soft, certain commands of men who had read ledgers and found a debt. The riders were close enough now that the snow underfoot seemed to tremble with their approach. She tightened her hand around his sleeve, nails biting into wool. The rune at her throat flared white-hot. A bell struck underwater. The light ran like a river beneath the linen, and the cold bit at his face. The world narrowed to the two of them, and the sound behind them, a tide that would not be held. From the ridge below, a torch flared and a shadow rose against the aurora like a spear. The riders had found the line they had followed. They were close enough to be heard, close enough to be felt, close enough to be seen. Thank you for being here. I hope you enjoyed this chapter. This tale is inspired by Nordic dreams and heart. Stay close for the next chapter of this saga.